Hello everyone, members of the national government, members of the Budget Committee of the Honorable National Congress, deputies, senators and leaders, both from La Libertad Avanza and from the rest of the political spectrum who are with me today, and all Argentines watching from their homes. Good evening. Today we are here to present a national budget proposal that will forever change the history of our country, so that we can once again become the great Argentina we once were. After years in which the political class lived by putting restrictions on individual liberties, today we come here to put restrictions on the state. This budget proposal we are presenting here today has a methodology that protects fiscal balance, regardless of the economic scenario. This means that, regardless of what happens to the economy at the macro level, the fiscal result of the national public sector will be balanced. This fiscal protection opens a new page in our history, one that was previously unknown. From now on, Argentina will be solvent, with the resulting drop in country risk and interest rates, and consequently, an increase in investment, productivity, real wages, and, ultimately, a decline in poverty and extreme poverty. In fact, I can't help but mention that we are here today, in this same house where, in December 2001, during Adolfo Rodriguez Sá's presidency, Argentina's default was declared and applauded by a packed house and amid enormous jubilation. That default, which was celebrated and applauded by the entire ruling class, would be the beginning of a populist cycle that has destroyed Argentina. Some may wonder why I am here tonight, when the Minister of Economy is generally the one who presents the national budget that the executive branch proposes to Congress. I decided to do so personally for two reasons. First, because I am an economist, and I am also proud of that. I am the first economist president in Argentine history, to be more precise, and since I am an economist, probably by professional deformation. For me, the destiny of a people depends on the economic decisions they make, because only on the basis of a healthy economy can people truly exercise their freedom. Well, the first and most important of these decisions is about what the state should be responsible for and how it will use taxpayers' money. That, no more and no less, is the national budget. Let us remember that, in some sense, modern democracy as we know it today is the child of a revolution that was born under the principle that there can be no taxation without representation. The main task of this honorable House, for which it was conceived, is to establish a national budget to define what the state does with taxpayers' money. The second reason I am appearing here today is because I come to propose a budget proposal that is diametrically different from what we are used to. Not just different, but the most radically different in our history, and I have learned firsthand that the deeper the change, the greater the effort required to fight for it. That is why we are here today. Because the national budget is not just another law, it is the law of laws. It is the roadmap under which we will prioritize our management in this current national era. The cornerstone of this budget is the first truth of healthy public administration, a truth that has been neglected in Argentina for many years: zero deficit. The first thing to understand is that when governments want to spend and spend compulsively and lack the leeway to continue raising taxes, as is the case in Argentina, the only way to pay the bill is by borrowing money or printing it at the central bank. Let us briefly recall the historical methodology of our ruling class. Since politicians do not understand budgetary constraints and do not want to stop spending, they generate deficits. To cover this deficit, the first thing they do is take on debt. But since they don't make the necessary adjustments, the debt becomes unpayable. And then, they default. This is how we became the world's largest serial defaulter. But default isn't harmless. Falling into default produces, in Argentina, the now famous capital flight. Then, dollars begin to become scarce. And politicians have no better idea than to establish tariffs or export duties to seize dollars from the private sector. And on the other hand, they establish capital controls to try to retain the scarce dollars the country generates. Since this causes Argentina to run out of credit in the financial markets, they have no better idea than to issue money, which, as we know, generates inflation. Footnote: because inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, whether you like it or not. To combat inflation, they implement price controls, which we've known for 4,000 years don't work. And they invent regulations that destroy private property, hinder economic calculation, destroy capital, and consequently increase poverty and indigence. This is the sad Argentine history of what politicians and analysts call economic policy, which in Argentina has been nothing more than the systematic violation of citizens' property rights. In other words, the deficit is only covered with debt, which is nothing more or less than future taxes, taxes on future generations, or with more current taxes or with the issuance of money. In Argentina, there can't be more taxes. It's the country with the highest number of taxes in the world. And if we add to that the fact that 50% of economic activity is informal, formal taxation in Argentina is around 60%. This is truly absurd for a country that desperately needs to accumulate capital. Once the possibility of raising taxes is ruled out, the other way to solve the deficit is with debt, that is, burdening future generations with today's waste. This is nothing more than surrendering the lives of our young people on the altar of populism. In other words, it implies the extermination of future generations, who today are already 70% poor. But Argentina, as a result of being the world's biggest serial defaulter, lacks access to credit. For now, this precludes any type of debt, even if it were desirable, when in reality it never is. And when that alternative is exhausted, the deficit is paid by printing pesos, which is stealing from all Argentines through seigniorage. To give you an idea of the swindle we've experienced, politics has robbed Argentines of nearly $25 billion a year in seigniorage over the last 20 years. And I say, robbed, not as a euphemism, but literally, because the more money is issued, the less each peso an Argentine has in their pocket is worth, with the painful addition that inflation, which is a direct consequence of monetary issuance, hits those with the least hardest between 25 and 30 times harder. The deficit problem, however, is nothing new. In Argentina, we've had a fiscal deficit 113 times over the last 123 years. And those 10 years we didn't have a deficit were because everything had already blown up and we were in default. This means that for practically 100% of our modern history, governments have failed to comply with this basic economic truth and passed the bill on to ordinary Argentines time and again. It also means that this will be the first year in Argentine history with a fiscal surplus without default. What a lack of management! It is no coincidence, then, that we are the worst serial defaulter in modern history if we have lived a century taking on debt we cannot repay. It is no coincidence that we have lived with exorbitant inflation for the last century, having ended 2023 with the highest year-on-year inflation in the world, above Venezuela and Lebanon. It is also no coincidence that, in the last 120 years, we have gone from having the highest GDP per capita in the world to being a country where 60% of the population is poor. The serpent's egg of all of Argentina's economic problems, of all of them, which is the fiscal deficit, is the only constant throughout our history. Because debt is a product of the deficit, monetary issuance is a product of the deficit, inflation is a product of financing the deficit with issuance, and the destruction of capital is a product of the indebtedness that generates the deficit. Therefore, poverty and indigence are a product of the deficit. You may then ask who this model can serve. Well, you know what the mother of the deficit is, the reason there are deficits, the inexhaustible compulsion of politicians for public spending, which knows no budgetary constraints. Because only by spending money that isn't theirs can they do business for themselves, their clients, and their friends. Friedman already said that there is no worse way to spend than government spending, because there are 4 ways to spend money: spending your own money on yourself, spending your own money on others, spending other people's money on yourself, or spending other people's money on others. And since you don't know other people's preferences or are responsible for other people's money, because you don't know how much it costs to obtain it, the worst way to spend money is to spend other people's money on others, which is precisely what government spending is. Today, something must be made clear once and for all. There is nothing, absolutely nothing, more impoverishing for ordinary Argentines than a fiscal deficit, and there is nothing, absolutely nothing, that enriches politicians more than a fiscal deficit. This is the sad role that public spending plays in the caste model. Politics has adorned this model with good intentions and bombastic theoretical frameworks. For years we have heard them talk about social justice, which is not only unjust, but extremely violent. Because social justice implies taking from some to give to others, based on an inconsistent principle that says that where there is need, a right is born. But the problem, my friends, is that needs are infinite and resources are finite. Therefore, when politicians demand more and more spending to distribute money that isn't there, what they are really doing is defrauding the entire Argentine people. They are playing with everyone's future to score a few political points with some well-thought-out speeches along the way. Because politicians know perfectly well that when they increase public spending, they're putting money in one pocket of the people and taking double from the other. That's why we vetoed the public spending increase bill passed by this Congress, and that's why we will veto all bills that threaten fiscal balance. And we do this because we will not be complicit in defrauding the Argentine people to adopt a populist measure. The only context in which we will agree to discuss a spending increase is when the request comes with an express explanation of what budget cuts must be made to cover it. If not, it will be vetoed. This, which should be a self-evident truth, seems like sacrilege uttered in this House, the place from which all the populist measures that have ruined this country have come. The paradox is that they always emerge with enormous support, because it is an unspoken rule of Argentine politics that the more votes a bill has in Congress, the worse it is for society. They have demonstrated this once again in this House in recent weeks, because they have one thing very clear, which outweighs any harm they might inflict on society. They know that if the deficit ends, many lose their businesses. Unfortunately, this compulsion to spend among politicians has been a constant throughout the last century in Argentina. From 1901 to the present, there have been 22 economic crises in Argentina. 20 of those 22 were characterized by high or downright extravagant fiscal deficits, which generated profound volatility in the Argentine economy, jeopardizing investment and growth. That said, let us pause to recall what the fiscal picture was like prior to the crises we remember with the most anguish. Before the Rodrigazo, the fiscal deficit was 14 points of GDP. Approaching the crises of 1981-82 with the exchange rate table, it was 11 points. Before the hyperinflation of '89 erupted, the national government was saddled with an 8-point deficit. And behind one of our recent national traumas, the convertibility crisis of 2001 and 2002, we had a deficit of 7 points of GDP. A clear pattern emerges in this journey. In addition to politicians' persistence in spending money we don't have, the country's resistance to fiscal distortion is increasingly weak. Each time crises erupt, the deficit decreases. And you might wonder why this happens. It happens because, having abused all the existing deficit financing mechanisms, both Argentines and the markets give us less and less credit. This means that, when we address the inherited situation, we are not just talking about the 2023 massacre, but the cumulative effect of an entire century of recurring crises. It also means that, if we don't solve it now, if we don't fight this fight once and for all, the solution will become increasingly difficult and will soon become an almost impossible task. Well, in politics, in economics, and in life itself, you don't choose which cards to play. You play with what you're dealt. Fools ignore reality, fools deny it, and those who bet on success accept it and resolve it. The hand we were dealt was nothing more or less than the worst inheritance in history, both in fiscal and monetary terms, and in multiple dimensions of Argentine social life. We inherited a consolidated deficit of 15 points of GDP, of which 5 points belong to the Treasury and 10 to the central bank. More than any of these crises I just mentioned. But some who call themselves economists, who make a living by purposefully forgetting things, appear on television every day pretending we lived in Switzerland. To put it in tangible numbers, reducing the deficit by 15 percentage points of GDP meant cutting spending by around $90 billion. Which is nothing more than saying we're returning that money to the Argentine people. In other words, we're not exaggerating when we say we've implemented the largest adjustment in human history. That's why I'm surprised that leaders of all stripes and colors so often accuse us of poor management. To those I say, you know what? Managing isn't about appointing thousands of officials in every corner of the state when half of those areas shouldn't exist. Managing isn't about a national director signing a resolution to spend millions of pesos on services that the private sector can provide better and more cheaply. Managing isn't about building roads that lead nowhere or overcrowded housing that no one wants. Managing isn't about knowing how to use the GDE, as former candidate Massa said. To manage means to have avoided the hyperinflation they left us on the brink. To manage means to clean up the central bank's balance sheet and defuse the debt bomb we inherited. To manage means to reduce public spending the way we did, in record time, and without abandoning the most vulnerable sectors of society. To manage means to have passed the largest legislative reform of the last 40 years with 37 representatives and 6 senators. Which is why I am also very grateful to those who have supported us in all these legislative actions. To manage means to send the 31,000 gnocchi we have sent in these first 9 months. To manage means to approve the single paper ballot, a banner of those who talk about transparency but have done little for it. To manage means to eliminate the intermediaries who profited from poverty. To manage means to have eliminated the pickets and to have gone more than 4 months without street closures in the Amba, Basque Country. Managing also means reducing homicides by 75% in Rosario. Managing means removing the endless regulations in all sectors of the economy to make life easier for entrepreneurs and workers. Managing means regaining the trust of the private sector and encouraging them to plan to invest more than $50 billion, as they have already announced. Ultimately, managing is not managing the state. Managing is shrinking the state to enhance society. In 1 year, we are resolving the disaster that our predecessors, by action or inaction, created for more than 120 years. So, when those responsible for the failure accuse us of poor management, we proudly embrace what we are doing. However, the enormous challenge remains. And now we must make the most of the titanic effort made by all Argentines and ensure its sustainability for the future. That is why we have decided that part of our legacy will be to forever change the methodology by which the budget is prepared. The deficit has always been a consequence of first thinking about how much to spend and then figuring out how to finance it. We're going to do it the other way around. First thinking about how much we need to save and then figuring out how much we can spend. That's why we're proposing an unbreakable fiscal rule for this budget and for all budgets going forward. I invite you to come back for a minute and solve the X with me to understand what this is all about. You can abstain, because you're having trouble adding. Look, whether I read it or not. You're still having trouble adding it up, Martinez. You can still take note because I'm starting now. Let's go. The first premise we start from is that the primary surplus must necessarily equal or exceed the amount of debt interest payable. So if the primary surplus is the result of netting revenue with current and capital expenditures, primary expenditure will have to be equal to or less than revenue minus the primary surplus. That is, the level of spending to be disbursed will be conditioned by the level of primary surplus to be achieved, which in turn will be conditioned by observed revenues net of the amount of interest to be paid on the debt. That said, let's now focus for a second on spending. Current spending is composed of the sum of automatic spending illegally indexed by law and discretionary spending. Automatic spending is the spending component indexed to inflation and other macroeconomic variables. Discretionary spending is not indexed, meaning that no matter how much inflation there is, it remains the same. Under this new scheme we are proposing, if revenues are higher than estimated, automatic spending could increase in line with revenues. But discretionary spending will remain frozen. On the other hand, looking now at revenues, when the increase in tax collection is temporary, the state will be able to save by absorbing pesos or paying off debt, which will allow it to continue lowering inflation and/or improve Argentina's debt profile. And if permanent economic growth and, consequently, the increase in revenue is structural, the state will be able to return this increased revenue to society through tax reductions, as we have committed to. On the other hand, if the economy does not grow and revenues are lower than estimated, automatic spending will also fall, and we will reduce discretionary spending until a zero deficit is also achieved. Therefore, this time it will be the public sector, not the private sector, that will absorb the effects of the shocks to the economy. In short, our budget methodology will achieve three unprecedented objectives. 1. It will permanently protect fiscal balance, ending debt write-offs and issuance. It will force the state to assume responsibility for and absorb the effects of shocks to the economy. And when there are better permanent conditions, as will be the case in the coming years, it will force us to return the excess revenue to society through tax reductions. This means that, if this methodology is maintained from now on, we will not only be able to reduce taxes, but also the size of the state, which is the true tax burden. I want to repeat this again so that it is clear and there is no doubt. This methodology we are presenting in the national budget protects the fiscal result, regardless of the macroeconomic scenario. No matter what happens with the economy, no matter if our estimates are right or wrong, whatever the economic scenario, the fiscal result will always be guaranteed. But for this to be possible, in Argentina we owe ourselves an honest debate about what the national state should and should not take care of. We have become accustomed to thinking of the national state as a nanny who has to take care of everything, from feeding to entertaining each citizen. But when a state assumes tasks that are not its responsibility, it ends up failing to fulfill the fundamental responsibilities that do correspond to it. Thus, we have arrived at a state that, in its eagerness to fulfill all the supposed desires of its citizens, cannot even remotely fulfill its basic obligations. This is how we arrived at 50% poverty, the return of illiteracy, astronomical crime rates, an energy system that can't withstand 4 days of heat in a row, an abandoned and unresponsive armed forces, a tragically slow justice system, and public hospitals without supplies that can't cure anyone. Meanwhile, billions of pesos were squandered on concerts attended by 300 people, public media at the service of militants, and routes that led nowhere, and they spent their days enacting laws that ranged from ridiculous to useless to harmful. As Cicero said, the closer an empire comes to collapse, the stupider its laws. And Kirchnerism has done some pretty stupid things. And worst of all, it left us with a system in which 70% of public spending goes to various types of social spending. This, which for years has been hailed as a success across the political spectrum, indicates nothing but a humanitarian tragedy. Because it means that more than 20 million Argentines cannot support themselves without state aid that is funded by robbing a segment of society with taxes. If anyone thinks this is desirable, let me tell you they're wrong. Does it seem to you that this is unrelated to the state's poor performance of its essential tasks? That's why it's time to go back to basics and reshuffle and redefine some definitions. The fundamental thing a national state must do is ensure macroeconomic stability, foreign relations, and the rule of law. Period. Any other issue can be resolved through the market or is the responsibility of subnational governments. To be clearer, let's break it down into parts. What is macroeconomic stability? That there be no fiscal deficit, that there be monetary stability, and, consequently, that there be no inflation, and that economic growth be facilitated. It facilitates this because private individuals decide what to invest in, not some bureaucrat sitting in a chair who, in the middle of it, grabs something along the way. Moreover, that without inflation there be no price distortion, and that, consequently, individuals, families, and businesses can recover economic calculation, the ability to plan, and ultimately recover their future. What is the rule of law? Security to protect citizens from potential attacks by others on their lives and property. Justice to impartially resolve conflicts between citizens and punish those who break the law. And defense to protect us from potential conflicts with other countries or external threats. I repeat, any other issue can be resolved through the market or falls within the purview of subnational governments. It must be understood once and for all that it is not the state's job to interfere in the economic process. We do not believe in countercyclical economic policies of any kind. We believe in freedom, property rights, and the free expression of prices. If the economic cycle is genuine, that is, if it is of real origin, the state has nothing to do but guarantee macroeconomic stability and the rule of law. If the economic cycle is not of real origin, but is generated by the state, it is the same as accepting a mobster who breaks our legs and then offers us crutches. We don't want the state's crutches. We want to live in freedom. We don't want our legs broken. Just as the deficit is the heart of the problem, reducing spending to achieve a surplus will be at the heart of the solution. Why? Because it's the only way to return to Argentines the fruits of their labor that the state currently steals from them through taxes. A zero deficit will make the debt sustainable. Debt sustainability will lower country risk and reduce financial costs, contributing to increased investment and savings, and, consequently, to a rise in real wages, which is the only way to reduce poverty and extreme poverty. In turn, it will mean lower future tax pressures on taxpayers, which will mean greater incentive to invest. In a globalized economy, and even more so since the advent of the Internet, capital has become nomadic. Today, anyone can open an account in the United States or Paraguay without leaving their home. And they do so seeking better tax conditions than those we offer. That is why it is imperative that Argentina once again become attractive to Argentines. We must end this impulse to expel our compatriots' capital with prohibitive taxes, which only reduce the flow and size of our economy, punishing the country as a whole with more poverty and greater exclusion. We want Argentine companies to become competitive again, so they can hire more workers, pay them better salaries, and thus stem the exodus of human capital we've been experiencing for more than 20 years. We must once and for all embrace the idea that the best thing for a worker is an entrepreneur who invests. But the only way to multiply the number of companies is to stop them from reaching into their pockets and free them from the hell of regulations, permits, and sky-high costs that private activity in Argentina entails. To reach this point, we have proposed the most ambitious structural reform plan in Argentine history, which began with Decree 70/23, continued with the approval of the Basic Law enacted by this Congress, and continues with all the deregulations we announce daily, adding to the bills we will continue to submit to this Congress. Thanks to this massive state reform we have undertaken, we will be achieving levels of economic freedom similar to those of Germany, France, or Italy. In less than a year of administration, against all odds, and we are on a firm course and determined to be the freest country in the world, because freedom will bring us prosperity and make us great again. However, Even if everything goes as we expect, this war we are waging against public spending and Argentine costs is being fought at all levels of the state, as well as in provincial and municipal jurisdictions. Therefore, I say to the governors, fulfilling the commitment to reduce consolidated public spending to 25 points of GDP requires the provinces as a whole to make an additional adjustment of $60 billion. We have already fulfilled our part of the agreement, now it's up to you. Argentines throughout the country know perfectly well that for every peso the provinces and municipalities stop spending, they can return it to you in lower gross income or other taxes. If you comply with this popular mandate, good Argentines will be grateful. But let me say that there is something I am sure Argentines will not allow. When the national government eliminates or lowers a tax, you want to raise yours. It will not work. Argentines are a rebellious people, tired of the tricks of politicians. We are living through a pivotal moment in our history. Do not underestimate it. In fact, when I entered politics, I stated that I did not come to lead lambs, but to rouse lions. I repeat, so I don't complicate the ending. When I entered politics, I stated that I didn't come to lead lambs but to awaken lions. And I tell you, if you haven't seen it or don't want to see it, the lions have awakened. Finally, finally, finally. Do it within the budget and not in a demagogic manner, harming all Argentines, exterminating young people. Finally, I want to speak to the members of this Congress. This is a pivotal moment in the history of our country. Moments don't often come along where we can change the course of history. If it were easy, we wouldn't be where we are today. Therefore, we have the opportunity, more than the opportunity, the obligation to seize this moment, because remember, the deeper we sink to the bottom of the sea, the more we have to swim to get back up. But the only path to progress is to end the fiscal deficit, reduce public spending, eliminate taxes, and trust in the Argentine people's exercise of freedom. Everything you hate. If we do things right, we will live in a country with economic stability, where planning a life project, starting a family, or starting a profitable business will once again be a reality. If we do things right, we will top the world's rankings of economic freedom. If we do things right, we will have a country where the state will once again be a servant of its citizens, not their lord and master, as Milton Friedman said. If we do things right, we will reverse the century of humiliation to which Argentines were unjustly condemned. Therefore, honorable members of the National Congress, the current national political moment offers you two options. One is to do exactly the opposite of what we have been doing for more than 100 years, to take off and make Argentina great again. The other is to continue doing the same old thing, leaving everything as it is, and maintaining this rotten system that impoverishes all Argentines day after day. Those are the two paths. Know, members of this honorable Congress, that the decision on which side of history you want to stand is yours. It will then be the citizens who will place you on the side of the righteous or on the side of the miserable rats who gambled against the country and its people. Finally, I want to quote again Marcus Tullius Cicero, the great Roman legislator, who said, "The budget must be balanced, the treasury must be replenished, the public debt must be reduced. The arrogance of public officials must be moderated and controlled, and aid to other countries must be eliminated so that Rome does not go bankrupt. People must learn again to work instead of living at the expense of the state." This phrase is more than 2,000 years old. more than 2,000 years old, and you have learned nothing from it. I trust that this Honorable National Congress will debate the draft national budget with the responsibility and seriousness that our current situation requires. May God bless the Argentinians and may the forces of heaven be with us. Long live freedom, damn it. Long live freedom, damn it. Long live freedom, damn it. Thank you very much.